All right, why don't we go ahead and get started? This is our next Q&A session with Jennifer Grant. And Jen, thank you for the second presentation about the imposter syndrome. This is a topic that you and I have talked about, several different times, and I really appreciate you being, open and, sharing that kind of information, which a lot of folks don't want to talk about, and particularly people who are, already established authors. But, I think it was just really interesting to hear kind of how pervasive, how common, that is. And I've certainly heard it from many folks that I deal with who are early stage authors too. So thanks very much for, raising this issue, I would say, and giving it more visibility than what's often the case. So again, to ask questions, there are three different options. One is for you to raise your hand in the webinar controls, and I can call on you to verbally ask a question. Second is that you can type questions into the question and answer field, and you can type questions into the chat field. So, any of the above is perfectly fine, and I'll moderate those and ask Jennifer, so you don't have to worry about, fielding them all yourself, Jen. But I'd like to, just start by talking about, this imposter syndrome phenomenon. And do you feel that it's one of these things that a person, if they experience it, will continue to experience, or does it get easier over time to deal with?
I think people do experience it, not ongoingly like daily, but I think that when there's certain situations where you might find it rearing its ugly head every time you're in those situations. But if you can, use some of those strategies to know exactly what it is, to say it's normal, to sort of keep yourself in the present instead of kind of ruminating and getting lost in negative thoughts, then it's sort of like you can kind of get rid of it more quickly. I think those thoughts, it sounds like from everyone that I've read about who's experienced it, including myself, but even people who are really high achievers, like the people that I put on that slide and so on, they continue to have it throughout life. But I think we get better at managing it and spending less time with it and knowing it for what it is. One of the times that I've talked about this, about imposter syndrome to writers, I kind of had, we did kind of an exercise together of trying to call to mind like some kind of villain or creepy character from a movie that you'd seen as a kid. And so I brought up the child catcher from Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, who was such a creepy and scary character when I was growing up. And I wanted to show people in this exercise that we did in person that imposter syndrome is a fiction. It's a fictional villain that sort of tries to scare us and tries to hold us back and keep us from doing our work. But if you can kind of separate yourself from it and see it as a piece of fiction that you can choose to say, oh, that's not real. You don't go through your life afraid of, Pennywise from It or the child catcher, because you know that it's not real. And so if you can say to yourself, this isn't real, this is just some feelings. It doesn't really say that who I am. It just speaks to the fact that this is a normal human experience. Then you can kind of get rid of it. And so, yeah, I think ongoingly people have to battle it at different times in life. And we all go through cycles where you feel more or less confident or you feel more or less sure-footed. And so when those things come up, I think we can just continue to address them.
Cool. So we've got a question from Lori Erickson, one of our other speakers. Hi, Lori. I think you need to unmute yourself, Lori. Lori, you there? Lori, hello, Lori. I don't know why, but I guess for some reason we can't hear Lori. I'm trying to unmute her, and for
Maybe she
whatever.
can type it in if she wants.
Yeah, Lori, why don't you just type in your question, if that's okay, because we can't hear you for whatever reason. While she's doing that, let me ask you, a couple other questions, Jen. Is imposter syndrome basically the same as low self-esteem, or are those two different things?
I would say they can overlap. Like a person who's experiencing imposter syndrome probably has feelings of low self-esteem, but I don't think they're exactly the same. Imposter syndrome seems to be, and at least this is from those women who coined the term, it's an experience that people who actually are achieving things in life, who actually have the right to be speaking about whatever it is. For instance, I kind of tell the story of when I wrote my first book, which was about the adoption of my youngest child. By the time I wrote it, I had been a newspaper columnist. And I had interviewed, I don't know. I mean, I want to say 100 people, both people in who work for adoption organizations, adoptive families, adoptees. I had done so much research and really immersed myself in the world of adoption and international adoption. And yet when I got the book contract to write Love You More, which is about adoption, I thought, oh, I have no right to be speaking about this. Who am I? I'm not an expert. And so it's sort of less about like low self-esteem necessarily and more sort of feeling unqualified when you really are qualified, and so I actually was qualified to write that book because it was my story for one thing. And so I have the right to tell that story, but also I had done a lot of research and I had done, a lot of thinking over many years about this topic. And so imposter syndrome sort of says to you, you have no right to speak about this. You're not an expert. And that's where we can kind of name it and say, oh, right now I'm feeling, and I think the reason I felt that way with that book is that it was very vulnerable. It was a very personal story. And so when you have those kind of tender feelings and unsettled, vulnerable feelings, sometimes those imposter thoughts can kind of sneak in.
So are there other times in your life when you've had to battle this type of feeling?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, that's of course why, I did so much research about it. I had a time where, with that first book that I wrote, I had always been really comfortable being kind of behind the scenes with my writing. So I wrote a newspaper column. I had written blog posts. I had written articles, and I was always the person sort of, interviewing other people. And then when I wrote that, when I wrote Love You More, suddenly I was being asked to speak in front of groups about adoption or about that book or my experience and so on. And I was really uncomfortable, as many of us are, and maybe many of us who are introverted writer types. I was really uncomfortable going in front of people and speaking. And so I was sort of thrown into this world of having to go and speak about this, speak about adoption, talk to adoption support groups and so on. And so even though I was prepared and I worked really hard on it, I had the feeling of being an imposter when I was asked back to those groups. And I had never heard of this syndrome, of the imposter syndrome, but I had hired many years ago, probably about 10 years ago, an executive coach because my kind of writing and editing life felt really disorganized to me, and I wasn't sure how to organize myself as a sort of small business. You're very good, of course, at doing that kind of work, but I wasn't. And I confided in this executive coach that I was surprised that I get being asked back to speak about adoption to these groups. And I said, well, I'm really not a good public speaker, and I don't understand why they're asking me back. And I think they're going to probably figure out that I don't belong, I shouldn't come back and they shouldn't ask me back and so on. And then she said, have you ever heard of the imposter syndrome? And I said, no. And she said, the fact that they're asking you back means you do bring some kind of value to this. So, you don't need to keep questioning that. And my homework for that month of executive coaching or whatever was to do more research on imposter syndrome. And I found it so liberating to hear that it's so commonly experienced that, and I think too, my heart of course is with writers. I think as writers, we're often by ourselves. We're it's us and the blank screen or the blank notebook page. And so it's very easy for us to get lost in negative thoughts if we go down that sort of pathway. And so that's why I feel really excited and passionate about talking about imposter syndrome to writers, because I want to help normalize it. I want to say this is a normal experience, and I don't want it to hold you hostage or me hostage. So so I've experienced it many times. And when it creeps in, I usually remember my own advice. Now that I've talked about it so many times with writers, I usually go, oh, I'm having some imposter thoughts. This is normal. What can I do to grow in my craft? What can I do to remember the value that I do bring to things? And so I do try to practice what I preach with this.
So Lori did type us a message. She's on her phone on a bike ride, so she wasn't able to make the mute or unmute work.
That's awesome.
But she said, great job, Jennifer. Very well done presentation. She's reminded of another resource that relates to this. It's called A Guide to the Good Life, The Ancient Art of Stoic Joy.
Oh, I'm going to write that down.
It's an author by the name of Irvine. It's about managing your thoughts. Again, the title is A Guide to the Good Life, The Ancient Art of Stoic Joy. Oh,
I love that.
So it sounds like something that our friend Steve Hanselman would know about, since he's written the Daily Stoic, but I'm not familiar with it. So
thank you, Lori. I will find this. I will read it.
We can check that out.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
So we have another question from Renee Simpson.
Hello.
Hi, Renee.
Hi, Brian. Hi, Jennifer.
Hi.
Yes, thank you so much for your presentation. It's so current for me right now because it's something I grapple with, even for participating in this conference, because I think I'm kind of a new writer. I used to write before when I lived in Jamaica, but I haven't published in a long while. So imposter syndrome is something that I grapple with. Mm-hmm. I want to agree with you so much that part of conquering it or managing it is actually talking about it, Mm-hmm. So I wrote a little bit about it a couple of weeks ago, and I actually published it on my Medium page.
Oh, awesome. How do we find that? Maybe, Brian, we could I would love to read it.
Oh, sure. Thanks. I'm going to be reading it in my open mic session tomorrow, but I'd love to share the link anyway.
Great.
Yeah, but what I found is that I only got 35 claps, but some of my friends read it who were struggling with imposter syndrome without my even knowing. Mm-hmm. So I feel successful in publishing it because one of my friends, she read it and she told me, I'm glad you wrote it, glad you published it, glad you brought it up. And it actually gave her the courage to publish her online magazine, because she was thinking, oh, nobody's going to read this. Mm-hmm. It doesn't make sense for me to do this. But, I was happy that her reading what my experience is with imposter syndrome actually encouraged her to confront hers and put her offering in the world. It also helped another friend who was thinking of doing a PhD. It actually helped her to decide, yes, I'm going to actually do this. I can do this. I'm qualified, So I think it's something that writers need to confront. We need to uncover it for each other and, not let it prevent us from putting our work in the world, because there is value in what we bring, so.
Absolutely. And the way that because you took that risk,
yeah,
people are taking their own risks and doing their work,
Mm-hmm.
You enabled that by writing this. That's
really
wonderful to hear.
Thank you. So thank you for, bringing it up in the conference setting. I think it's very important in this kind of forum. Thanks.
Okay, well, thank you.
You're welcome.
Renee, if you could email me the link to your article.
Oh, sure.
What I will do, I'll put it in the notes of the YouTube video for this Q&A session.
Okay,
So
I'll do that for sure.
Other people can have access to it.
Okay, thank you. I'll do
Sure.
that. Okay. You're welcome.
All right, so we have a note from John. He says, Dr. C.A. Tripp, a New York City psychiatrist who's now deceased, said that one of the recurring issues he's dealt with in counseling very successful corporate executives was the fear that the closer they got to success, the more fearful they were of succeeding in. Interesting problem. I'm not sure where he wrote about this, but Jen, thank you for discussing it. He can identify with your situation here.
Yeah, and sometimes too, another thing I've heard that might be relevant to that is that sometimes when people are really suffering from imposter syndrome, the more praise they get. So if they're a really successful, business person and they're getting a lot of praise and even they're helping their business to really succeed, if they're suffering from this, they feel worse the better they're doing. It's not that they feel better the better they're doing. They feel worse because the fear of being found out, the fear of being seen as a phony escalates too. Unless of course they're doing the work of like naming it and trying to address it. But if they're not aware that they're dealing with it, it can be worse and worse the more successful and the more praise that they get.
All right, so we've got a question to, let's see. Promote to panelists. So Rick Jordan.
Hi. Yes, thank you very much for, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Rick.
Great.
How you doing?
I'm doing very well, thank you. I really appreciate this seminar. I've not thought about imposter syndrome before, so this is new things for me to learn. One thing that for me, the way it affects me is, you get you send so many things off, and then you get so many rejection.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like, well, one year I sent a lot of poetry off, and I got a lot of publications. And I thought, wow, well, maybe I am a poet. And then the next year I sent off just as many things and had like maybe 2 things published. Mm-hmm. And it's like, well, what happened there? It's like, what? Maybe I'm not a good poet then. So, how do you deal with this idea of, well, maybe I'm just a one-hit wonder? And when you get a series of rejections to say, yeah, but I need to keep on. I mean, I think that's my thing is like, well, that now I've had a season where I just haven't seen anything off because it's like, well, I have sensed those rejections. And so, so anyway, I don't know how you might think that kind of imposter syndrome could be addressed.
Yeah, I mean, that does sound like it to me too, because of you clearly have success as a poet, right? Even if you send 100 things and you get 2 things published, it's so hard to get poetry published that is a real accomplishment. But I wonder, do you have like a writing group or a manuscript group that you are a part of? Because I have found that watching other writers encounter that, which is so, I want to encourage you and say that's so common that some years seem like everything's hitting and your work is really finding the right editor and all that stuff. And then there are often years that are not like that, and that are sometimes, some writer friends of mine call it like almost like looking at a field that has to take a break, like has to lie fallow, and in a way, like those times of writing about what it feels like to be disconnected and to feel like things aren't hitting is, of course, more fodder for poetry and for our writing, but also I think a really natural part of being a writer. Not everything's not like up into the right. You know what I mean? We go through this kind of tangled time of, some years we find the success and encouragement. So that would maybe relate to the point on when I said that when we're really struggling with those feelings, it's great to look back at our real achievements, and you have real achievements. But I would also say that it's helpful to me personally to have a close group of writing friends, because when I'm dealing with disappointment and I'm feeling like misunderstood or like my work isn't finding its audience, I'm able to talk with other friends and they go, yeah, me too, or that was me 2 years ago, or yes. And then to kind of see that that's sort of a natural part of being a writer too, but it's hard. I don't mean to trivialize the fact that it's very painful, especially when you're opening up and writing poetry and doing your good work and you're sort of like, why am I doing this if I'm not finding my readers? But so I would say, like, to revisit the accomplishments you have had and that are real is a good thing to do. And also, if you can, interact with other writers whose writing journeys will probably seem very similar to that, where some years you have to just hold on to your hope with a thread, and other years can feel much more successful. I don't know if that's helpful, but my heart goes out to you because I understand that feeling.
Well, certainly, in terms of rejections, I mean, my goodness, everybody that I've talked to that's an author, and I've talked to a lot of them, they've just gotten tons and tons of rejections, and sometimes even rejections without a rejection. I mean, it's like you don't even hear
Right.
back from whether it's a publishing house or an agent or whoever. So that's a very common phenomenon in this industry. And, but I can totally understand how it's frustrating and could be, a trigger for a person feeling, that way.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Jen, what experiences have you had that have been, particular triggers for this?
Yeah, well, in terms of, Rick's point about rejections, over the years of writing everything that I've written, and I've written in all kinds of different genres, that's been really true to my experience. Now, I think that I am, and again, I would encourage anyone listening to try to identify a few trusted writer friends, and I don't know, they can be from a professional organization, depending on I don't know, for Rick, like, what are the, I don't know, maybe there would be ways to connect with people through journals like Poets and Writers, or the Poetry Journal, or events or things like that. Because I think that one of the dangers of being a writer working at home by yourself is that those disappointments are really, they cut really close to the heart. And it really is helpful to be able to share it with someone and say, hey, I'm feeling terrible because I wrote a beautiful chapbook full of poetry and I can't find a publisher. And, your writer friends will be able to acknowledge the pain of that. And also maybe they'll say, oh, you know what, this one poem is one that I would revisit, and, here's some ideas. But it's just so helpful to have other people to talk to and get out of your head, at least for me, and not be trapped with negative self-talk, but instead have other people who love your work and who care about you and who care about whatever it is that you're writing. So I hope maybe you already have poets that you interact with, but yeah, there have been definite years where I think the truth is, I don't, now when I get a rejection, I think my skin has gotten a lot thicker. Like I tend to think, okay, well, I really embrace having a lot of different ideas and different things that I'm working on. So I think I handle it a little better internally than I did maybe 10 years ago, in that I know I'm seeing kind of the long view. And I guess I would encourage all of us too to see the long view on our careers. And if we have a year that is disappointing, to kind of fight through that. It would be a shame to let those circumstances keep you from continuing to create, because obviously you have a passion to do that.
Here's another question for you, Jen. Do you think a disciplined daily writing practice makes imposter syndrome better or worse? And on that note, can you talk about your own writing practice?
Sure. I don't know if it maybe I haven't ever thought of it in that context, like whether having a daily practice would make it better or worse. Might make it better. It might make it feel more like your writing is a job. So, I was just saying to someone the other day, an editorial client, about how if we call someone to repair something on our house, they don't, we wouldn't expect to hear that person say, well, I don't really feel the muse today to, fix that broken gutter or whatever. I have to get back to you when I'm feeling more inspired. Or if they said, well, I'm not really that great at this job, I'm just sort of struggling, that's not the person you'd hire. So in some ways, like a daily writing practice could help a person like just see this as this is the work I'm doing. So I'm going to do this much time per day. I think everyone's really different. Of the many writers I know, some people have a early morning writing practice. Some people, everyone's different. For me, it really depends. I've been more and more over the last couple of years trying to follow kind of my circadian rhythms. I read something a couple of years ago about circadian rhythms, and it really made a lot of sense to me. And that is that in the few hours after many of us wake up, and again, if this doesn't fit you, not everyone's exactly the same, but generally speaking, people do really good like left-brained organizational work in the mornings. And so what I do in a normal work week, and of course the last few months have been anything but normal, but is to, in the mornings, try to take care of more administrative things and answering email and planning for the future, maybe figuring out my calendar and all that kind of thing. And then in the afternoons, where many of us maybe have kind of a more dozy post-lunch lull, that's the time where I try to do creative work. So that's when if I have a new book idea, I'll just kind of get a journal out or a notebook out and start just kind of free writing. Or I do a thing where I heard this at a wonderful conference for newspaper columnists several years ago, but when you're doing a first draft or really dreamy work, to cover your computer screen with like a dish towel or piece of paper and just write that draft and not look at it. So then you don't have the little judge that's sitting on your shoulder going, oh, that's not very good. Oh, that doesn't make any sense. That's not going to work. So instead you just kind of get it all out. So I try to do that in the afternoons. So yeah, mornings kind of administrative, afternoons more creative, artistic work. And then often on Fridays, I end up doing just like cleanup from the week, like answering emails, circling back with people about certain things. So I don't know, that's kind of a loose sense of my schedule to answer that question.
One thing I do need to do is give Jen a shout out because, she talked about being part of groups, to get feedback from each other and things like that. And, I'm not a writer, but I rely heavily on people like Jen to give me feedback, particularly when I'm thinking about some new idea, like a children's book conference or a new webinar series, as two specific examples. So first of all, I just want to say thanks to Jen,
My pleasure.
For being that kind of sounding board for me, and just to kind of reiterate how important having key advisors is to your work, whatever you're doing. So anyway, so Jan makes a comment: in addition to practice, understanding one's identity as a writer is important, especially if this is a second career when the identity shift can be hard. Very true. I've heard that, from several folks too, that, maybe I've got confidence and expertise in one particular area that I've been working in all my life or whatever. And now that I'm doing something different, that necessarily doesn't apply psychologically. So,
That's right.
so we've also got a question from Karen Moritz. Hi, Karen.
She's popping up. Hi, Karen.
Hello, can you hear? Nope, you can't hear me yet.
Yeah, no, we can. Hi, Karen. We can hear you.
Yay, okay. You'd think I'd be a pro at this Zoom thing. I'm on it like all day sometimes. It's insane. I really want to thank you for your presentation. I was one of those people, if we'd been there in person, I think I cried through half of the presentation because I said, oh, somebody else feels the same way I do. It was amazing because I thought I was just a weirdo. So I really appreciated that and the concrete suggestions you gave. I've been also reading The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron. Talked some about that. So I've been working through some of her exercises for some of that, but it was just really helpful. And I happen to be a pastor as well. So I'm juggling writing sermons every week and newsletter articles and all that stuff, but I have other things I want to work on, and I keep talking myself out of it because I think, who am I, you know? So your thing was really helpful. And I really appreciated your comments at the end about remembering that for us as spiritual writers, there's that sense that we feel a calling, that it's not just something fun we want to do, but there's a sense of call about it. And I wondered if you could say a little bit more at the end. You quoted somebody about, am I really a writer? And if so, if you ask that question, you are, like, could you talk a little bit about who that was? And
yeah, so that's a book, and I sort of flubbed the title of it. Hold on, I'm finding it for you. So this is a book that a lot of my friends who are writers and artists have really gotten value from. And the author is Stephen Pressfield. Sorry, I'm looking it up on my phone as it's called The War of Art. And it really digs deep into, and he's just Pressfield, P-R-E-E, or P-R-E-S-S, and then Field. But he really digs into what it means to be a person who's creating something. And if you want to go like next level on thinking about what it means to be an artist, and it sounds like if you're doing the artist way, then you're doing some of that work already. But he talks about the fact that we shouldn't make it seem like it's to create something is like a job. We're not putting together something from instructions. We're really digging deep inside of us. And again, Julia Cameron does handles this really well as well. But if I thought that quote was maybe a comfort to us, for those of us who have had imposter syndrome feelings, because it once again underscores that having them doesn't mean you're a phony. Having them might mean you're even more authentic a writer, because you care and because you are digging deep and because you do bring your vulnerable self to the work you're doing. And so I don't know, I find that idea really freeing, and I hoped it would be for all of us as well. Just that, if somebody is, full of themselves and grandiose, and, sometimes, I've heard writers sort of feel less than because they'll say, oh, but so-and-so on Twitter has such a big following and is so whatever. But that's where we can get into a bad pattern of comparing ourselves and comparing things like our social media platform. Not that it's not very important, and it is, but comparing things like that with what we're doing internally as artists. And so I hope that by naming and acknowledging and being able to battle imposter syndrome, people can create from a more true place, and that I can as well, and can create work that does align with our calling and our identities. So I don't know, that's kind of a roundabout answer to your question, Karen, but I hope that answers it a bit.
That's really helpful, because I am so grateful to Brian I went to his workshop a couple years ago at my former seminary, and have just sort of been on the periphery. And Brian, I just really appreciate what all you're putting this together, and he has a writers group that meets the second Tuesday of the month, which I started attending because when I lived in Prague, the Czech Republic, I had a great writers group. We used to joke we were a drinking group with a writing problem. So that kind of tells you what else we did during that group. And they were great because it really spurred me to explore different things. But then when I moved back to the United States, that kind of dried up. So I haven't found that, and Brian's website and stuff has really helped motivate me to think about it. So I just really appreciated the presentation today and some of the concrete steps you gave us so that I can hopefully battle that a little bit more effectively. I usually just give into it. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm so glad you'll get past it.
Well, thank you very much, Karen. And
Thank you, Brian.
Prompted an idea for me, maybe on our second Tuesdays writers discussion groups. Maybe we should have that quarantini edition, and we can all have a martini while we're talking about writing or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah, then I can have my drinking group with the writing problem again. That would be great.
Exactly. I think that's a great tagline. So.
Thanks.
Anyway, so thank you, Karen. Let's see. We've got a good question from John. He says, Jen, you're obviously a writer, and you mentioned an editing client. Are you also an agent? What are the fields you cover?
I'm not an agent. So although I think it would be sort of fun to be an agent, I don't think I have the skills. I don't know that my skill sets would be great that way. I've found that it's helpful with agents I've had when they're lawyers as well, just because so much of, the way I see their work, and Brian, you've talked in depth to a lot more agents than I have, but it's not only being plugged into the publishing agent industry and knowing kind of what our trends and what our editor is looking for and all that stuff. But in my case, the way agents have really helped me is when we need to puzzle down to some legal language in these contracts. But yeah, so I am a writer, and I've written 5 books for adults. I'm working on my 6th one right now. And I've written both some parenting books and also a devotional and some other work like that. And then also the last few years I've been working on in children's lit, and I've written some board books and picture books. And that has been like a wonderful foray into children's literature, which I love. But yes, I also do editorial consulting. So I've helped people write their book proposals. I've done some collaborative, also known as ghostwriting, although I think we're supposed to say collaborative writing. And I have done just different work. Like I take a few, I don't do a ton of it. I take a few clients a year and either walk them through an idea to writing a proposal, including sample chapters, or sometimes I'm kind of more like what Brian's and my friend Margot Starbuck and I call a book doctor, so somebody, either a publisher or a writer, will have a finished manuscript and be really struggling with it and not sure why the editor keeps saying to rework it, or just knowing it's not working. And I really love digging in and like helping a writer restructure, so that I do more developmental editing like that too. But no, I'm not an agent. Sometimes that job as an editorial consultant is like being a cheerleader, so you're, helping people feel, energized around their project when they're having those times of kind of losing the thread of it or feeling like they can't finish or whatever.
So on the, to further answer that question, on the Writing for Your Life website, there is a section called Writer Support Services. And Jennifer is one of the partners that I have on there that does, various forms of editing for hire. And so you can learn more about Jen and the specific services that she offers there. So it's just called Writer Services, I think, at the menu. Here's a question from Nikki. I was thinking about the aspect of call. Seems for some Christian writers, imposter syndrome can be compounded, especially if we're dealing with dead ends and rejections. Did I discern the call wrongly after all? How can we shore up spiritually and practice spiritual disciplines that help us discern and be patient and proactive? I'm sorry.
And provocative maybe too. Yeah, I think that's, again, maybe I would go to the whole looking at your career or your calling over a long, over the long view. If you write an article and it's rejected, or a poem or a story or a picture book or whatever it is, maybe there's a part of us, if we are looking at it like a calling, and when we're feeling most sort of spiritually grounded and healthy, which of course, isn't every day or every month or every year, but maybe we can see those obstacles as an opportunity to learn, like, well, maybe I had to write that article because in a year or two, I'm going to need that knowledge base for something. I was just saying, I have a daughter who's a rising junior in college, and she has an internship this summer, and some of the work she's had to do is really dry. And she's been talking about that. It's indexing things and things that require a lot of attention to detail and aren't, hugely exciting for her. But I said to her, the way I've seen life kind of unfold for myself anyway, is that some of the skills that I picked up in situations like that, later I'll think, oh my goodness, I'm so glad that I know how to do this. I'm so glad that I've already had to be trained in this. And so in a way, like in terms of our calling, maybe seeing the long view and having a sense of trust that if we have been given this calling, these different things that come our way, if it feels like they align with the work we're trying to do, or that as best we understand it, we do it, and we let go of our expectations for whether it'll be a huge success or whatever. We do the work. If it feels like obedience to do it, then we do it, and we let our expectations go about what we're going to get back from it. At the same time, I think it's really good to hone, what is that calling? Like what, I attended, actually, Brian did a webinar about the business of spiritual writing, and you had a whole thing about looking at your mission and looking at, what is in consumer projects, we look at it like brand, but like, what is it you're trying to say? And maybe, one opportunity could be to look at what is my calling as a writer? It's not just to write, but what's the message that I've been given to give, and what's the story that is mine to tell and that will be the most help to other people? I don't know, Brian, you want to talk about, you articulated that really well in the business, the platform building seminar that I attended. But, and I think too, by the way, I guess I'm saying two things at the same time that might sound contradictory, but all the writing, if you're given an article to write or a blog post or an opportunity to write, I always tell, especially for emerging writers, take it, because all that writing, all that thinking will only make you a stronger writer. At the same time, as you go along in your career, then you sort of have to make more decisions around what projects you want to take, or does this align with my mission? Does this align with my gifting, and all that stuff. So I don't know. I don't think that was a very good answer, but.
No, it's a tough situation. A lot of these, there's no kind of like cut and dried answer or way to deal with it, I think.
Mm-hmm.
So what other questions do we have? Anything else that you want to talk with Jen about this morning? Well, Jen, thanks so much. Really appreciate, as always, collaborating with you.
Thank you.
And this afternoon, we're going to be hearing from Javon Bolden. Javon actually has 3 separate presentations. We're going to have Q&A associated with those as well. So I hope you can join us then. But thanks again, Jen, and thanks everyone for joining us.
Yeah, thanks everybody.